What does it look like when the most righteous man alive loses everything he loves in a single afternoon? His flocks, his servants, his 10 children. And heaven never explains why. Not slowly, not as a punishment he could trace back to some hidden sin. In one day, messenger after messenger, each arriving before the last had finished speaking, each bringing news too large for a human heart to hold. And behind it all, unseen by the man suffering it, a conversation had already taken place. A conversation in a realm he could not see, between a God he trusted and a figure the ancient text calls simply the accuser. This is the story of Job. It is one of the oldest stories in the Bible, older perhaps than Moses, older than the Exodus from Egypt, a story wrapped in poetry so dense that scholars have spent 3,000 years trying to unpack it fully. It asks the one question every suffering person eventually asks, and then. This is the part almost no one remembers. It refuses to answer that question directly. If you have ever lain awake, wondering why a good life fell apart for no reason you could find, stay with this one. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and settle in, because this is a long and quiet road through a very old book. But to understand what happened to Job, we cannot start with the disaster. We have to start with the man, before the disaster ever touched him. Back when his life still looked like proof that God rewards the faithful. The text places him in the land of Uz. Scholars still argue over exactly where that was. Some locate it east of the Jordan, in the territory later associated with Edom, pointing to a genealogical note in Genesis that ties a man named Uz to that region. Others place it further north and east, in Aram, closer to the upper Euphrates. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is a clue about its age. Job never mentions Israel. He never mentions Moses, or the covenant at Sinai, or the law that would come to define so much of the Old Testament. He offers sacrifices himself, as the patriarch of his own household, exactly the way Abraham did generations before any priesthood existed. Many scholars believe this places Job's story in the same hazy patriarchal era as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A world of tents and flocks, where a man's righteousness was measured not by ritual law, but by the plain shape of his character. The book itself belongs to a category scholars call wisdom literature, alongside Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and parts of the Psalms. Writings less concerned with recounting national history than with wrestling, honestly and sometimes painfully, with the deepest questions of how to live. But Job stands apart even within that company. Its Hebrew is famously, notoriously difficult, dense with rare words that appear nowhere else in the entire Old Testament, poetic constructions so unusual that translators across the centuries have sometimes had to guess at their meaning from context alone. Scholars have proposed dates for its composition ranging from the era of Solomon to well after the Babylonian exile, centuries apart, and no consensus has ever fully settled the question. What almost every scholar agrees on, regardless of when the book reached its final written form, is that the story itself, the setting, the characters, the world of Uz, draws on a tradition far older than any of the proposed writing dates. A folk memory of a righteous sufferer that had likely circulated, spoken and sung, for generations before anyone set it down in the sophisticated poetry we now read. The prophet Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian exile, mentions Job by name alongside Noah and Daniel as one of the 3 legendary examples of righteousness. Proof that by the 6th century before Christ, Job's reputation had already become proverbial. A byword for integrity, the way we might invoke a figure from ancient legend today. And Job's character, the text insists, again and again was extraordinary. Blameless and upright, it says. One who feared God and turned away from evil. This is not flattery. It is the narrator's own verdict, stated before a single trial begins, and it matters enormously for everything that follows. Whatever happens to Job in the chapters ahead, the reader is told from the very first verse. This was not a man hiding some secret sin. This was, by the text's own account, the most righteous man of his generation. His wealth reflected it, at least by the measures of his world. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, a household of servants large enough that the text simply calls him the greatest of all the people of the East, 7 sons, 3 daughters. In an economy built entirely on livestock and land, Job was not merely comfortable. He was a legend in his own region, the kind of man other fathers pointed to when they wanted their sons to understand what a well-lived life could become. But wealth was not what made Job remarkable. It was what he did with it, quietly, when no one else was watching. His sons took turns hosting feasts in their homes, each one inviting his 3 sisters to join him, a picture of a family bound together in genuine affection rather than rivalry. And after each round of feasting ended, Job would rise early the next morning and offer a burnt sacrifice for each of his children, not because he knew they had sinned, but because he feared they might have, quietly, in their hearts, where no father could see. "It may be," he said, "that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was his habit continually, the text says. A father standing guard over the souls of his children long after they had grown and left his house. Notice, too, the word the text uses for his caution. He was not merely religious in an outward sense, performing the correct rituals at the correct times. He feared God, a phrase that in the Hebrew Bible describes something closer to a settled reverence, a habitual awareness of standing before a holy and watching God in every ordinary decision of daily life. Ancient rabbinic commentators, reading this opening portrait centuries later, sometimes debated whether Job's righteousness was in some sense even more remarkable than Abraham's, precisely because Job, unlike Abraham, apparently lived entirely outside the covenant community, without the benefit of a specific divine call, a promised land, or a chosen people to belong to. He simply feared God on his own, in a pagan-adjacent world that offered him no particular incentive to do so, and he did it consistently, for years, long before any crisis tested it. Sit with that image for a moment. Here is a man who had no reason to worry. His life had every outward sign of divine favor. Flocks that multiplied, children who loved one another, a name respected across the entire eastern region. And still, he rose in the gray hour before dawn to intercede for sins he could not see and could not prove. This was not a man performing righteousness for an audience. This was a man's private, unwitnessed devotion, which makes what happens next, what was already happening, in a place Job could not see, almost unbearable to consider, because far above the tents of Uz, in a scene the book of Job describes with startling and unadorned simplicity, something was unfolding that Job himself would never learn about. Not in this life. Now there was a day, the text says, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Pause on that word. In English translations, it reads like a proper name, as though a specific individual called Satan simply walked into a room. But the Hebrew is more precise and more unsettling than that translation lets on. The word is ha-Satan, with the definite article attached. Not Satan as a name, but the Satan, the accuser, the adversary. In the Hebrew Bible, this phrase functions almost like a title or an office within the heavenly court, the way we might say, the prosecutor, rather than naming a specific person. Some scholars believe this figure functioned in the divine council, somewhat like a prosecuting attorney, whose task was to test the sincerity of human loyalty to God, to walk the earth and report back on whether human righteousness was genuine or merely self-interested. Later Jewish and Christian theology would develop this figure considerably, eventually identifying him with the fallen tempter of Genesis and Revelation. But within the book of Job itself, on its own terms, the text is careful, almost restrained. This is the accuser present in the heavenly court, and God addresses him directly. "Where have you come from?" God asks. "From going to and fro on the earth," the accuser answers, "and from walking up and down on it." And then God says something that should stop every listener cold, something that places the entire tragedy that follows squarely inside a conversation Job never heard and never consented to. "Have you considered my servant Job?" God asks. "There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." The accuser's answer is the hinge on which the whole book turns. "Does Job fear God for nothing?" he asks. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has, on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." It is, in its own way, the oldest and sharpest question about faith ever recorded. Is righteousness only ever transactional? Strip away the blessing, the theory goes, and you will find nothing underneath but self-interest. God permits the test. "Behold, all that he has is in your hand," he says. "Only against him do not stretch out your hand. Life itself, for now, is protected. Everything else is not." This is not the only place the Hebrew Bible pulls back the curtain on a heavenly court in session. In the book of 1 Kings, the prophet Micaiah describes a vision of the Lord seated on his throne, with all the host of heaven standing around him, debating how to lure a wicked king to his death on the battlefield. In Psalm 82, God is pictured presiding over an assembly of divine beings, rendering judgment among them. These scattered glimpses suggest that ancient Israelite readers took for granted a heavenly court of some kind, a council of spiritual beings surrounding God's throne, even though the Old Testament never lingers there long or explains its structure in any systematic way. Job's opening chapters give us the longest, most detailed look at that court anywhere in Scripture. And it is worth remembering that later, when God finally speaks to Job out of the whirlwind, he will describe the foundation of the world itself as a moment when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The same phrase, sons of God, reappears there, suggesting the council Job glimpsed in chapter 1 was not some strange aberration, but a fixed and permanent feature of how the ancient Israelite imagination pictured the government of the universe. A throne room, populated, attentive, and almost entirely hidden from human sight. Job never hears this exchange. Neither do his friends when they arrive later to comfort him. Neither, in fact, does the reader learn it from any human character inside the story. We, the audience, are simply told, as though the narrator has pulled back a curtain that no one on earth was permitted to see. And that structural choice is, itself, part of the book's genius. We watch the entire drama that follows with knowledge Job does not have. We know why. He never will. Not fully. Not in the way we expect a satisfying answer to arrive. The disaster came on an ordinary day. The text tells us Job's sons and daughters were gathered at the eldest brother's house, feasting and drinking wine together. The same familial ritual that had repeated itself so many times before. And then, one after another, 4 messengers arrived. And the rhythm of their arrival is one of the most devastating pieces of narrative construction in the entire Bible. While he was yet speaking, the text says, 4 times, like a drumbeat. The first messenger came running to say that the Sabaeans, raiders from the south, had fallen upon the oxen and donkeys while they were plowing, killing the servants with the sword, and only he alone had escaped to tell Job. While he was yet speaking, another came, saying that fire had fallen from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants watching them, and only he alone had escaped to tell Job. While he was yet speaking, a third messenger arrived, saying the Chaldeans had formed 3 raiding bands, fallen upon the camels, carried them off, and put the servants to the sword. And only he alone had escaped to tell Job. And then, while that messenger was yet speaking, a 4th came. And this is the one that breaks the pattern, because this is the one where the language slows down, where the narrator lingers, because the news itself was too large to deliver quickly. Your sons and your daughters, the messenger said, were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. 4 disasters, 4 losses of livelihood and servants, and then, in the final blow, the loss of every child Job had. Not gradually, not with time to process one grief before the next arrived. All of it compressed into what feels, in the reading, like the space of a single held breath. What Job did next is the reason his story has survived 3,000 years. He did not curse God. He did not rage against the messengers, or demand an explanation, or collapse into the kind of despair that seems, on paper, entirely justified. Instead, the text says, Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. Consider how strange that sequence is. Tearing one's robe and shaving one's head were the standard outward signs of mourning in the ancient Near East. Gestures every listener in Job's original audience would have recognized instantly, the physical language of grief in a world without any other way to display it. Job performs every one of those gestures. He does not pretend the loss is small, or suppress the mourning, or perform a stoic silence that denies what has happened. He grieves, fully, visibly, the way his culture understood grief to be expressed. And then, having grieved, he falls to the ground, and he worships. Naked I came from my mother's womb, he says, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Notice what he does not say. He does not say the accuser took it away, though we, the reader, know precisely who orchestrated the calamity. Job attributes it, without hesitation, to the Lord himself. Not because he is wrong about second causes, the raiders and the fire and the wind, but because he understands, at a depth few of us ever reach, that everything he had ever possessed was always, ultimately, a gift held on loan. The sheep were never really his. The camels were never really his. Even the children, as dearly as he loved them, belonged first to the God who had given them. It is worth knowing that this single line, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord," did not stay confined to the pages of an ancient book. It became, and remains today, part of the traditional Jewish liturgy spoken at the graveside, words mourners have repeated for centuries over the bodies of their own children, parents, and friends. A sentence born out of Job's private catastrophe in an unnamed land somewhere east of the Jordan has quietly become one of humanity's most durable formulas for grief that still, somehow, chooses worship. Few lines in all of ancient literature have traveled that far, from a single suffering man's mouth into the ongoing grief of an entire people, spoken again at graveside after graveside for thousands of years since. The narrator's own verdict follows immediately, and it is worth hearing slowly. In all this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Not in all this Job felt nothing. Not in all this Job understood what was happening. Simply this, that his grief, however real, however total, did not curdle into an accusation against the character of God. This is not stoicism. It is something far rarer. It is worship that survives contact with genuine devastation, and it is offered by a man who had no idea, not yet, that the trial was only beginning. Because in the heavenly court, the accuser was not finished. Then Satan answered the Lord, the text says, and said, "Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give for his life." but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The accuser's theory needed refining. Perhaps possessions alone were not the true test. Perhaps a man could lose flocks and children and still hold on to his integrity, so long as his own body remained untouched. Touch the body, he argued, and the mask will finally fall. God permits the second test with the same restraint as the first. Behold, he is in your hand, God says. Only spare his life. And so Job was struck with loathsome sores, the text says, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. A description ancient commentators have connected to everything from severe boils to something resembling elephantiasis, though the text itself leaves the precise medical picture deliberately vague, more concerned with the totality of the affliction than its clinical name. Job took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself and sat down among the ashes. The posture, in the ancient world, of complete desolation, a man who has been stripped of every marker of status and reduced to sitting in the refuse pile outside the town. It was here, in that posture, that his wife spoke to him, and her words have troubled readers for millennia. "Do you still hold fast your integrity?" she asked. "Curse God and die." It is easy, reading this from a great historical distance, to condemn her instantly. But consider what she, too, had just survived. She had lost the same 10 children Job lost. She had watched her husband's wealth vanish in a single day, and then watched disease consume his body before her eyes. Some Jewish commentators, reading with unusual compassion across the centuries, have suggested her words were less a temptation to blasphemy than the raw cry of a woman who could no longer bear to watch her husband suffer. That "curse God and die" was almost a mercy, a wish that his agony would simply end, one way or another. The biblical text never gives her a name, a silence that later readers found hard to accept. A Jewish work from around the turn of the era known as the Testament of Job. Not part of the biblical canon, but a fascinating window into how later generations retold and expanded this story. Names her Citus and dramatically expands her role, portraying her as selling her own hair to buy bread for her suffering husband, wandering from house to house, begging on his behalf. It is a tradition worth knowing precisely because it shows how deeply this story embedded itself in the imagination of readers who came after. How badly they wanted to understand the woman standing beside Job in the ashes, rather than dismiss her with a single harsh line. Whatever her intent, Job's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the entire book. "Shall we receive good from God," he said, "and shall we not receive evil?" And the narrator adds, with a phrase whose careful precision some ancient rabbis noticed centuries later, that "in all this Job did not sin with his lips," a formulation that some in the Jewish exegetical tradition have argued, quietly leaves open the question of whether something was beginning to shift in Job's heart, even while his words still held. Word had traveled by now across the region, and 3 men set out from their own distant territories, having heard of everything that had befallen their friend. Eliphaz came from Teman, a city associated with the wisdom traditions of Edom. Bildad came from Shuah, likely connected to the descendants of Abraham through his second wife Keturah. Zophar came from Naamah, a location less certain but generally placed somewhere in the same broad eastern region. They made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. A detail worth noticing, because it means this was not a spontaneous visit but a planned journey, 3 men deliberately setting aside their own affairs to travel toward a friend's ruin. When they arrived and saw him from a distance, the text says, they did not even recognize him. The disease and the grief had changed him that completely, and their response, before a single word passed between them, is one of the most quietly profound moments in the whole book. They raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes, just as Job had. They sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, the ancient gesture of shared mourning. And then they sat down with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. 7 days of silence. In a culture that valued speech, that prized the wisdom of a well-turned proverb, these 3 men understood, at least at first, that some grief is too large for words, and that the most honest comfort a friend can offer is simply presence, unhurried and wordless, in the ashes beside the one who suffers. If the book of Job had ended there, it might be remembered as one of the purest portraits of friendship in ancient literature. It did not end there, and what follows, across roughly 35 chapters of dense Hebrew poetry, is Job breaking the silence first. He does not open with theology. He opens with a curse, not against God, but against the day he was born. "Let the day perish on which I was born," he says, "and the night that said, a man is conceived." He wishes that day had never existed, that it had been swallowed into darkness, erased from the calendar of the year. It is raw, unfiltered grief, poetry that has shocked and comforted suffering readers for 3,000 years precisely because it refuses to pretend. Job does not curse God, but he does, finally, curse his own existence, and in doing so he gives permission to every reader since who has ever felt the same forbidden thought and been too afraid to say it aloud. His 3 friends could not let that stand unanswered, and here the real argument of the book begins. Eliphaz speaks first, gently at first, appealing to a vision he claims to have received in the night. A spirit passing before his face, a voice asking whether any mortal can be more righteous than God. His conclusion, and the conclusion of Bildad and Zophar after him across the chapters that follow, rests on a single, deeply logical premise. In a world governed by a just God, suffering must be the direct consequence of sin. The righteous prosper, the wicked suffer. Job is suffering. Therefore, however hidden the fault may be, Job must have sinned. Bildad puts it more bluntly than Eliphaz. Perhaps, he suggests, it was Job's own children who sinned, and God delivered them into the hand of their own transgression. Zophar goes further still, insisting that God is in fact showing Job mercy, exacting less punishment than his guilt actually deserves. This theology was not unique to Job's friends. Scholars studying the wider literature of the ancient Near East have found strikingly similar wrestling with the problem of innocent suffering in other cultures of the same general era. A Babylonian composition, sometimes called "The Poem of the Righteous Sufferer," wrestles with almost the identical question, a pious man abandoned by his God without apparent cause. The Book of Job did not emerge from nowhere. It entered a conversation the ancient world had already been having, in different languages, under different gods, for a very long time. What sets Job apart is not the question. It is the answer. Or rather, the book's patient, almost defiant refusal to give the answer the friends insist on. The argument does not stay static across its 3 rounds. It sharpens and it darkens, as the friends grow more frustrated with Job's refusal to confess. In the second round, Zophar paints a vivid, almost gleeful picture of the wicked man's downfall. The sweetness of evil turning to the venom of asps in his stomach, his prosperity vanishing like a dream that flees at morning. Language clearly aimed at Job, an implicit accusation dressed as a general observation about how the world works. Bildad, in his second speech, describes the wicked man's own steps leading him into a net of his own making, his roots drying up beneath him, his memory perishing from the earth, torments waiting on every side. The unspoken accusation grows louder with each round. You are describing yourself, Job, whether or not you can see it. Job's own replies swing between 2 poles that never fully resolve. Bitter complaint against what feels like arbitrary divine violence, and stubborn, almost defiant hope that refuses to let go of God even while wrestling against him. In one breath, he says God breaks me down on every side and counts him as an enemy. In the next, he says, "Though he slay me, I will hope in him." He complains that the wicked prosper while he, the innocent one, is crushed, a direct challenge to the entire retribution framework his friends have built their case on. "The tents of robbers are at peace," he says, "and those who provoke God are secure." If suffering always tracked with guilt, Job argues, the data of the world itself would prove it false. He has watched wicked men live long, comfortable lives and die peacefully in old age, precisely the fate his friends insist only the righteous deserve. He also grows bolder across the middle chapters in his demand for a hearing. "Oh, that I had one to hear me," he cries. "Here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me." He wants, quite literally, his day in court. A formal legal proceeding in which he could lay out his case, point by point, and hear the specific charges against him, if any charges in fact exist. This legal imagery runs through the whole middle section of the book. Job repeatedly casts his situation in the language of a courtroom, himself as the defendant demanding to know the accusation, God as the judge he cannot locate, no matter how far he searches. "Behold, I go forward, but he is not there," he says, "and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand when he is working, I cannot behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I cannot see him." It is one of the rawest descriptions of feeling abandoned by God found anywhere in ancient literature. Not the absence of belief, but the far harder experience of belief in a God who has, for reasons unexplained, gone silent. Perhaps no passage in the entire dialogue lingers longer in memory than Job's meditation on the shortness of human life in chapter 14. "Man who is born of a woman," he says, "is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not." He compares himself, longingly, to a tree. For a tree, if it is cut down, at least has hope that it will sprout again, that its shoots will not cease, even if its root grows old in the earth. But a man dies, Job says, and is laid low. He breathes his last, and where is he? It is not despair exactly, and it is not quite hope either. It hovers somewhere between the two, and that suspended, unresolved ache is, in many ways, the emotional center of the entire book. A man refusing to lie about how short and fragile life feels from the inside, even while he refuses, in the very same breath, to let go of the God who made it that way. Even the name Job carries some of this ambiguity. Scholars have proposed several possible roots for the Hebrew name Iov behind our English Job. One connects it to a root meaning, "Where is my father?" a plaintive question that would fit the character remarkably well. Another connects it to a root associated with hostility or being treated as an enemy, fitting a man who at one point complains that God has counted him as his adversary. The uncertainty itself feels almost fitting for a book so committed to sitting inside unresolved tension rather than resolving it prematurely, because Job will not accept their diagnosis. Across 3 long cycles of speeches, Eliphaz, then Bildad, then Zophar, each rebuffed by Job in turn, the pattern repeating with mounting intensity. Job holds to a single, unshakable claim. He has not sinned in the way that would explain this. He knows his own conscience, and it is clear. "Till I die," he says, "I will not put away my integrity from me." He does not claim sinless perfection. He claims that whatever failures he carries are not proportionate to this catastrophe, and that his friend's tidy formula, suffering equals guilt, simply does not match the world as he has actually experienced it. And in his lowest moments, Job does something even more startling than protest his innocence. He begins to long, desperately, for a mediator. Someone who could stand between himself and God, argue his case, settle the dispute he cannot settle alone. "There is no arbiter between us," he laments at one point, "who might lay his hand on us both." And then, in one of the most quoted verses in the entire book, in the middle of his darkest despair, something breaks through that sounds almost like hope. "For I know that my Redeemer lives," he says, "and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God." Scholars debate exactly what Job meant by this in his own historical moment. Whether he was picturing a legal advocate, a kinsman redeemer in the ancient sense of one who avenges a wronged family member, or some fuller vision of vindication beyond death itself. Christian tradition has long heard in this verse an early, dim foreshadowing of resurrection hope and of a Redeemer who would one day come. The text itself leaves the fullness of that hope only partially formed. A flare of light in a very dark chapter, gone almost as quickly as it appears, before Job sinks back into argument and lament. Underneath all of this argument sits a question every generation since has had to face in its own way, in its own words, at its own hospital bedside or graveside or empty chair at the table. Where is God when the innocent suffer? Job's friends answer it by refusing to believe the innocent truly suffer at all. If the pain is real, they reason, the innocence must be an illusion. It is, in a strange way, a comforting theology because it keeps the universe predictable. If suffering always has a traceable cause, then a person can, in theory, suffer-proof their life through sufficient righteousness. Job's own experience dismantles that comfort, piece by piece, because Job knows. The reader knows, from the very first verse, that his righteousness was never in question. The book refuses either of the easy exits available to it. It will not say Job deserved this. It will not say suffering is meaningless or random, either, because we have already seen it originate in a very particular, purposeful conversation in the heavenly court. What the book insists on, instead, is something far less tidy and far more true to lived experience, that suffering can be real and undeserved, and still take place within a universe governed by a God who has not abandoned it, even when his reasons remain entirely hidden from the one suffering. That is a harder comfort to hold than either of the easy answers. It may also be the only comfort sturdy enough to survive contact with real grief. The three friends eventually run out of words. Zophar's third speech never comes. The pattern simply breaks off, as though even his certainty had finally been exhausted. And into that silence steps a fourth voice no one expected. His name is Elihu, and the text takes care to explain why he has waited so long to speak. He is younger than the other three, and out of respect for their age he had held his tongue throughout the entire debate. But his patience finally broke. Angry, the text says, at Job for justifying himself rather than God, and angry at the three friends for failing to answer him properly, and yet still condemning him. Elihu's speeches, spanning several chapters, are dense and sometimes repetitive, and scholars have long debated his exact role in the book's structure. Some seeing him as a genuine bridge toward God's eventual answer, others reading his youthful confidence as itself, a kind of gentle irony the book invites us to notice. What is clear is that Elihu shifts the ground of the conversation. Where the three friends insisted suffering must always be retribution for sin, Elihu suggests something broader, that God may also use suffering as discipline, as a kind of severe mercy meant to instruct rather than merely punish, opening a man's ear in the night through pain the way a dream sometimes opens it through vision. Elihu also introduces an idea the three friends never once raised across all their speeches: the possibility of a mediating angel, one of the 1,000, who might declare to a man what is right for him and be gracious to him, delivering him from going down to the pit, because a ransom has been found. It is a striking echo of Job's own earlier longing for an arbiter, a redeemer who could stand between himself and God. As though even in his youthful impatience, Elihu senses that the resolution to Job's suffering will not come through better arguments about cause and effect, but through some form of divine intervention and grace that none of the four men arguing in the ashes can fully provide for themselves. Elihu spends his final chapters dwelling at length on the greatness of God displayed in the weather itself. The clouds that God spreads out, the thunder that declares his presence, the snow that falls and confines every man indoors so that all people may know his work, the lightning that he directs even to the ends of the earth. "Do you know," he asks Job, in words that seem almost to be waiting for something, "how God lays his command upon the clouds and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine?" And as Elihu speaks, his language turns increasingly toward the sky, toward thunder and lightning and the terrifying, glorious power of a coming storm. It is, in hindsight, the perfect overture. Because as Elihu finishes speaking, that storm arrives in earnest. "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind," the text says. And what follows is one of the most staggering pieces of poetry in the ancient world. 4 full chapters in which God speaks and speaks and speaks, and never once answers the question Job actually asked. Job wanted to know why. God asks him, instead, where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid, who determined its measurements, who stretched the line upon it, who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. God asks whether Job has ever commanded the morning, or entered the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep, whether he has seen the gates of death, or comprehended the expanse of the earth, whether he can bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion, whether he knows the ordinances of the heavens, whether he can lift up his voice to the clouds and command a flood of waters to cover him, whether he knows when the mountain goats give birth, or can count the months the wild deer fulfill, whether he has given the horse its strength or clothed its neck with a mane like thunder, whether it is by his understanding that the hawk soars and stretches its wings toward the south. God continues on, question after question, refusing to let the pace slacken. "Who has cut a channel for the torrents of rain?" he asks, "and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man lives, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land and make the ground put forth grass? Does the rain have a father? Who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? And who has given birth to the frost of heaven?" He asks whether Job can send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to him, "Here we are." He asks who gave understanding to the mind, and who gave the rooster its wisdom to announce the dawn. He asks whether Job knows the time when the mountain goats give birth, whether he can observe the calving of the deer, whether he can number the months that they fulfill. He describes the wild donkey, to whom God has given the steppe for its home, the salt land for its dwelling place, scorning the tumult of the city and hearing no shouts of a driver. A creature that answers to no master, ranging the mountains for its pasture, searching after every green thing. He describes the ostrich, flapping her wings joyfully, though they are not the pinions of love, leaving her eggs on the earth to be warmed by the dust, forgetting that a foot may crush them, dealing cruelly with her young as if they were not hers. Because God, the text says almost wryly, did not endow her with wisdom, and yet, when she rouses herself to run, she laughs at the horse and his rider. He describes the war horse, whose neck is clothed with a mane like thunder, who paws in the valley and exults in his strength, who laughs at fear and is not dismayed, who scents the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. He describes the hawk, soaring by God's understanding and stretching its wings toward the south, and the eagle, mounting up and making its nest on high, its eyes beholding the field of battle from a great distance, its young ones sucking up blood wherever the slain are. It is, on its surface, an overwhelming, almost punishing barrage of questions Job could never hope to answer. And yet listen to what it actually accomplishes, beneath the sheer weight of its imagery. God is not scolding Job for asking. He is inviting him, through a tour of a universe far stranger, far more ordered, and far more wild than Job's small human vantage point could ever fully perceive, to reconsider the size of the God he has been arguing with. This is not the God of the Friends' tidy formula, a predictable dispenser of reward and punishment who can be reduced to an equation. This is a God who feeds the raven's young when they cry out in hunger, who gives the ostrich its strange forgetfulness and the warhorse its fearlessness, who governs a cosmos of staggering scale and staggering detail, from the storehouses of snow to the exact placement of every constellation. And then, in the final movement of the divine speech, God turns to two creatures whose identity has fascinated scholars for centuries: Behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth is described as an almost impossibly powerful land creature, its strength in its loins, its bones like tubes of bronze, its tail moving like a cedar, a beast so mighty that only its maker can approach it with a sword. Many modern scholars have suggested Behemoth is a poetic, larger-than-life portrait of the hippopotamus, an animal the original audience may well have known by reputation from Egypt, even if the poem's language pushes far beyond ordinary zoology into something closer to myth. Leviathan, described across an even longer stretch of poetry, is more ferocious still. A sea creature whose scales are its pride, shut up together as with a seal, whose breath kindles coals and out of whose mouth go flaming torches, a creature that regards iron as straw and laughs at the shaking of a spear. Some scholars connect Leviathan to the crocodile, again inflated into something mythic by the poem's soaring language. Others point to a wider ancient Near Eastern tradition in which a chaos serpent of the sea, called Lotan in the Canaanite texts discovered at Ugarit, represented the untamed, threatening forces of disorder that only a supreme deity could subdue. In that reading, God's final word to Job is not really about zoology at all. It is a claim of absolute sovereignty over even the most terrifying, chaotic forces in creation. Forces Job cannot begin to master, but that God holds, effortlessly, on a leash. The description of Leviathan alone stretches across an entire chapter, and God's questions grow almost taunting in their scale. "Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook?" he asks, "or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever?" Every question assumes an answer so obviously no that the questions themselves become a kind of poetry of futility, a deliberate, escalating demonstration of just how small human strength appears against the raw power woven into creation itself. And yet, the implication runs, this same untamable creature answers to God as easily as a shepherd's dog answers to a whistle. If Job cannot subdue Leviathan, the logic goes, how much less can he expect to fully grasp, argue with, or subdue the purposes of the God who made Leviathan in the first place? It is not an answer meant to humiliate Job. It is an answer meant to recalibrate the entire scale by which Job has been measuring his complaint. The point of the entire speech, then, is not to explain Job's suffering. God never mentions the accuser. God never mentions the wager in the heavenly court. God never offers Job the tidy resolution the reader has been holding in their own hands since the second chapter. Instead, God answers the question, why, with a much larger question. Who? Who governs this universe? Who sustains the raven and the wild goat and the impossible Leviathan? Who was there at the foundation of the world? The implicit claim is staggering in its simplicity. That a God vast enough to hold Leviathan on a leash can also be trusted with a suffering he has not explained. And somehow, astonishingly, it is enough for Job. "I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear," he says, "but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Notice, again, what this is not. It is not Job admitting his friends were right, that some secret sin caused all of this. The text never validates their theology. Quite the opposite is coming. It is not even, strictly speaking, an apology for what he said in his anguish. Earlier interpreters have sometimes read it that way, but the Hebrew is genuinely difficult here, and many modern scholars translate Job's final words less as, "I repent of my sin," and more as, "I am comforted concerning my dust and ashes." That is, comforted about his own mortal, suffering condition, now that he has encountered God directly rather than merely heard about him second-hand. Whichever reading one favors, the transformation is the same in substance. Job's demand for an explanation dissolves, not because he received one, but because he received something else instead, an encounter. The presence of God turned out to matter more than the answer Job thought he needed. What happens next may be the most theologically startling turn in the entire book. God speaks again. Not to Job this time, but to Eliphaz. "My anger burns against you and against your two friends," God says, "for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." After 35 chapters of confident theological argument, the three friends are rebuked, not commended. Their formula, suffering always equals guilt, is declared wrong, directly, by God's own voice. They are instructed to offer a burnt sacrifice, 7 bulls and 7 rams, and Job, the man they spent the entire book accusing, is told to pray for them so that God will not deal with them according to their folly. The man in the ashes becomes the intercessor for the men who never once stopped lecturing him. And then, at last, restoration. The text says the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends and gave him twice what he had before: 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 donkeys, 7 sons and 3 daughters, once again. And here the narrator pauses, in a way it never paused for the sons, to name the daughters specifically: Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch. In all the land, the text adds, there were no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. An almost unheard-of provision in the ancient Near East, where daughters typically inherited nothing while brothers remained alive. It is a small, easily overlooked detail, and yet it says something enormous about the man who emerged from the ashes, not embittered, not merely restored to his old life, but somehow more generous, more attentive to those the world tended to overlook than he had been even before the catastrophe. Job lived 140 years after that. The text says, long enough to see 4 generations of his children and his children's children. And he died, old and full of days. It is worth pausing on the order of events in that final chapter, because the sequence matters. Restoration does not come the moment Job stops arguing, and it does not come the moment God finishes speaking from the whirlwind. It comes, specifically, when he had prayed for his friends. The very men who spent the entire book insisting his suffering was deserved, who added theological insult to his very real injury, who never once, across 35 chapters, offered him a single word of comfort that did not come wrapped in an accusation. And Job prays for them anyway. Some readers have found this detail almost harder to accept than the whirlwind itself, that the path back to blessing ran directly through forgiveness of the very people who had wounded him further while he was already down. The text does not dwell on how Job felt doing this. It simply states that he did it, and that his own restoration flowed out from that act of intercession, as though the story wanted its final lesson to be about the shape of Job's heart at the very end, not merely the shape of his bank account. So what are we actually meant to carry away from this ancient, difficult, magnificent book? Not, I think, an answer to the question of why good people suffer. The book conspicuously refuses to give us one. We, the readers, know something Job never learned. The scene in the heavenly court, the accuser's wager, the reasons behind the disaster. And still, having been handed that knowledge, we discover it would not have satisfied Job even if he'd had it. Knowing the mechanism behind his suffering would not have carried the same weight as encountering, directly, the character of the God who permitted it. That is the quiet, almost unbearable wisdom at the center of this book. Some suffering will never be explained to our satisfaction in this life, and the invitation is not to demand the explanation, but to trust the character of the one who governs Leviathan and the wild goat and the foundations of the earth, and who, the New Testament writer James would later say, is compassionate and merciful. A conclusion James reaches only after specifically pointing his readers back to the patience of Job and to the purpose the Lord brought about in the end. Centuries later, some Christian readers would also notice in Job's aching longing for a mediator between himself and God, an early, unfinished shadow of something the rest of Scripture would eventually complete. Though the book of Job itself, written so long before, could only reach so far toward that hope, and no further. There is something else worth carrying forward from this book, and it has to do with the friends as much as with Job himself. Their theology was not entirely wrong. The Bible elsewhere does teach that sin brings consequences, that a life of persistent wickedness tends, in the long run, toward ruin. What made Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar dangerous was not that their general principle was false, but that they applied it with absolute, unbending certainty to a single suffering man in front of them, without ever pausing to ask whether this particular case might be the exception their formula could not account for. It is a caution that reaches easily across 3,000 years. Anyone who has sat beside a suffering friend and reached too quickly for an explanation, maybe this happened because everything happens for a reason, you must have needed this lesson, is standing, whether they realize it or not, in the sandals of Eliphaz. The 7 days of silent presence Job's friends offered before they opened their mouths may be the truest wisdom in the entire book. The chapters of confident argument that followed may be its clearest warning. If you are carrying a grief tonight that has no tidy explanation, a diagnosis that makes no sense, a loss that arrived without warning, a friend's confident theology that only made the wound feel worse, Job's story does not promise you an answer before morning. What it offers instead is company. A man who tore his robe and grieved fully, who argued honestly rather than pretending a contentment he did not feel, who demanded a hearing and was finally given, not an explanation, but a presence. The storm came, the questions kept coming, and somehow, impossibly, that turned out to be enough. Centuries later, the writer of the New Testament letter of James would point his own suffering readers directly back to this ancient story. "You have heard of the steadfastness of Job," he wrote, "and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." Notice what James emphasizes. Not that Job understood everything by the end, but that he endured, and that on the far side of his endurance, the character of God was finally made plain, compassionate and merciful, even through a silence that had lasted dozens of chapters. Some readers across the centuries have gone further still, hearing in Job's ancient longing for a mediator, someone to stand between his ash heap and the God he could not locate. A faint, unfinished note that the rest of Scripture would eventually resolve. A Redeemer who would not merely argue a case from a distance, but would enter fully into human suffering himself. The book of Job, written so long before that hope could be named outright, could only reach partway toward it, a single flare of light in the middle of the storm, and then it had to let the question rest, unfinished, the way most of our own hardest questions have to rest. We began tonight with a question. What does it look like when the most righteous man alive loses everything in a single afternoon, and heaven never explains why? Perhaps the truest answer, after all these centuries, is this. It looks like a man sitting in ashes, still speaking to the God who allowed it, refusing to let go of either his integrity or his relationship with the one who held the whirlwind. It looks like 7 days of silence that said more than any of the speeches that followed. It looks like a prayer offered, at last, for the very friends who made the suffering harder to bear. And it looks like a life, however scarred, however changed, that went on afterward to be full of years, full of children, full of a strange, hard-won peace that no explanation could have manufactured on its own. Let that be enough for you tonight, too. Let the questions you cannot answer rest now, unresolved but not unheld, the way Job's questions rested at last beneath a wider sky than he had ever imagined. Rest well.